Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first program of 2022. I am Janet Wong, a TriCities chapter board member and program committee member. We are looking forward to a robust discussion on the timely topic of the Great Resignation. Today's format will consist of 30 minutes of panel discussion, and then we will break into smaller groups for 30 minutes. Each breakout room will have a designated facilitator, and your group should select someone to take notes. After the 30 minutes of breakout, we will come back together and ask a couple of groups to provide their key takeaways. I'm going to thank Gail Stewart, who is my fearless co-leader in designing today's program. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors for their continued support of the TriCities chapter and also contributing to our quality programming. Also, please join me in a warm welcome to Moss Adams, our newest sponsor. And finally, we have some new members and those joining us for the first time today. So welcome and thanks for joining us. We look forward to engaging with you. We have a fantastic program, so without further delay, I will introduce our moderator, David Bixby. David is a managing partner with Meridian Compensation with over 20 years compensation consulting experience working with management teams and board teams. He's a frequent speaker on compensation topics and a member of the Texas Tri-Cities Chapter Advisory Board. David, welcome, and thanks so much for moderating and contributing to our program today.
Thank you, Janet. My pleasure. And welcome to everybody who's joining us today. So our topic today is the Great Resignation, and it's a term that's been thrown around quite a bit. What is it? It's a reshuffling of the workforce like we haven't seen in decades. The statistics that some of you may have seen thrown around are pretty startling. So through November 2021, 6.1 million jobs have been added last year, and that's the largest increase on record dating back to the 40s. 4.5 million people quit or switched jobs in November 2021, with healthcare and tech employees most impacted. And in that same month, there were roughly 0.7 unemployed people per job opening. So 10.6 million available positions, 6.9 million unemployed people looking to fill them, near record highs for both indicators. Weekly initial jobless claims are now below 200,000, which is lower than anything we've seen since 1969. And unemployment this year is forecasted to be around 3.8% by the end of the year. All pretty remarkable numbers.
Oh, you're not eating it? Huh? You're not eating it?
So clearly all of this change will have, or already has had, serious implications across the organizations you lead, the companies on whose boards you serve. Fortunately for everyone here today, we've assembled a crack team of experts to help us think about the causes, potential remedies, and leadership implications of this phenomenon. So without further ado, I will introduce our panel members here today. Carol Hess brings years of experience in executive and P&L management from Compaq and HP, where she led teams in areas diverse as product management, business operations, R&D, supply chain, marketing, and ESG. Since retiring in 2020, she served as CEO of Chess Executive Insights, providing coaching, public speaking, and consulting services for emerging companies looking to grow infrastructure, drive equality, build talent, and expand globally. Carol currently sits on the board of public company Y2Y, which is a global manufacturer of wireless connectivity solutions, and the board of the Texas Diversity Council, and until 2020, on the board of the Greater Houston Partnership. Bill Easter has a perspective informed by years of experience as an executive and director for multiple industries, including healthcare, energy, and aviation, some of those most impacted by COVID-19 and the Great Resignation. Since retiring as CEO and chairman of DCP Midstream in 2008, Bill has served on the boards of energy companies Baker Hughes and Concho Resources, and currently sits on the boards of Delta Airlines, Aeromexico, and Emerson Electric Company. He's also chairman of the board of Memorial Hermann Health System. And David Pruner is partner in charge of Heidrick & Struggles Houston office. He specializes in the infrastructure sector and in the energy sector, where he boasts over 35 years of deep experience. He helps companies with executive and board level searches, sits on several boards, including the Houston Ballet, and is also an adjunct professor at the Jones Graduate School of Business at Rice, my alma mater, so clearly he's a quality guy. And I know that David has plenty to share on our topic today because it was one of David's presentations on the subject that helped me, at least, to think about the Great Resignation in a more organized way. So we have about 30 minutes for our panelists to provide some perspective on this topic, fairly wide-reaching. I'll start off with a question to David and to Carol on some of the reasons behind what's been happening. I've seen a lot of terms thrown around in addition to Great Resignation, Great Realization, Great Reprioritization, and others. What do you see as some of the key reasons behind all of this movement and change?
David, I'd be happy to start, but obviously everyone feel free to jump in. And that is, we're finding that during the pandemic, a lot of people started to look at their career and really turn inward and take stock on their career and career development more than we've ever seen. And we could even tell by the conversations we were having all the way to executives and board members too, of what they're working on. The biggest one we think though is the tightness has created a higher pay situation. So people are leaving some of the service industries and instead going into e-commerce, Amazon, and places like that that are paying more with better benefits. So the resignation is actually a switching of jobs rather than actually resigning from the job market altogether. But at the same time, we think the pandemic really froze a lot of people in place. And what happened is they really felt like they didn't want to make a move because of the uncertainty during the pandemic. And now that demand is kind of being unleashed in the marketplace, and the economy simultaneously has done that, creating that. And then you have the basic ones. I think all of us suffered from one time or another, and that is the burnout and fatigue, the Zooms that end at 1:59 and the next one starts at 2 p.m. and we're starting to change that and so forth to do that. And as much in fun as it was to go ahead and dress in casual clothes, at least from the waist down, it wasn't enough to kind of prevent the burnout that a lot of us were feeling. And then the very real issue of dealing with childcare and elder care also were both just very difficult situations for many families. So those are just a few from my end.
So I'll jump in and add to that. Very similar, but I maybe say it in a few different words. So the pandemic happened, right? And businesses had to adjust very quickly. And many people just were told, you're going to work from home. And companies had to quickly figure out, what is Zoom? How do all my employees have the right technology at home? And how do I make that work? And as that happened, people adjusted. And as David said, lots of Zoom calls, Zoom fatigue, whatever. But people started working in a very different way. Doctors started working in a different way. You didn't have those telemed calls so frequently that now is very common. So all that was going on. And then the vaccine came. And there was a potential of we're going to shift back into the office. And at the same time, employees started saying, this work from home maybe isn't such a bad thing. Maybe I can relocate and move closer to a family member or a town I've always wanted to live in because I'm on a Zoom call anyway, so I can move wherever I want to. So those started happening. They also said, well, wow, I don't have that commute anymore. So maybe I'm saving some money on tolls and gas and saving time. And maybe I can have lunch with my family because I'm staying in the house and I'm saving money on not going out to lunch every day. So they started thinking about this savings and this lack of a commute. And then many of them started saying, wow, life is short. I've had a lot of friends get sick. I've had some friends or colleagues or family members pass away. I need to sort of reprioritize life. What's important to me? And it's bigger than just money. And maybe I want my job to fulfill these other parts of my life or give me a work-life balance. And maybe if I was in the service industry or in retail or hospitality, my spouse maybe is working also, and we can manage to let one of those jobs go, because if I go into a restaurant, I'm exposing myself every day, and then I bring that home. So I don't know if I want to have that exposure or that risk and bring it home. And then I think some people just started putting out feelers to say, wow, I heard my friend got a new job that was better with better benefits or whatever. Let me just see what's out there. So those things started happening in employees' heads. And then at the same time, if you start thinking about the workforce evolution, Gen Z and millennials coming into the workforce, and I think in the next couple of years, they'll be the bulk of our workforce, 80%. And they have a very different mindset, right? They want to work for companies that have a purpose, that are altruistic, that are doing something for the society and the environment. So they brought different ideas of work-life balance and where they wanted to reside. So you move all that together, and then the last sort of group are people who were maybe close to retirement, but said, you know what, I think I'm just going to take early retirement. This is, you know, not what I want to do anymore. Again, I've reprioritized my life. So I think these different groups started behaving differently, and it all kind of came together with this sort of great resignation. But I agree, a ton of great reshuffling happening as well.
You talked about a lot of different groups being impacted by this great resignation. What part of the organization, what types of roles do you think are most impacted? Does this reach all the way up to the C-suite?
So yes, and I think that's really interesting, because it's not just entry level, or it's not just millennials, or it's not just the people who are ready to retire. It is up and down the organization, and it's in all companies as well. So we're talking about a lot of corporate businesses, but it's also, again, hospitality, the medical field, right? All the different industries are impacted as well. And we do need to take a close look at, and I think maybe we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but what do we do to retain those CEOs and the directors in the organization, and make sure that we've got some level of stability within the executive management team?
And David, I would echo that. We very much saw, obviously, in the search world we're in, it's generally the more senior levels all the way up the board. I almost felt like there was a new business line we should have launched, which is just called executive therapy, because a lot of folks, and we deal with a lot of energy companies who were greatly under pressure, one, economically, and then two, from a PR standpoint too. And what we found was, for many of them, that yeah, they, all the way up to the board, they were all re-examining. And really what I think the whole pandemic did was accelerate things, hold them in place for a while, freeze them, and now it's accelerating everything. And so many who might not have made the decisions, and in fact, I think the number is about 1.5 million people that resigned last year for early retirement were not planning on doing that, but the pandemic was a catalyst for that.
Yeah, I might just throw in that in terms of that incentive to retire, many people wound up with larger 401ks or other benefits than they expected because of market performance, and you know, that certainly accelerated their desire to leave, made it easier to go.
Interesting. So, you know, do you think that there's still, I mean, are we looking at another wave coming? You know, have we seen most of the change and shift, or, you know, have things changed permanently, do you think?
I'd be happy to talk about at least the near term, what we're seeing. What's interesting is, so the advantage in our firm is we're global and we deal with all industries. So it's a real eye opener for me when I go into the leadership meetings and hear each group talk about their region and their individual sector in the economy. And really energy, which is a large part of obviously the Houston economy, ended up actually not seeing near as much, mainly because the huge pressure was under. The conversation was go as follows: listen, you know, I'm worn out. Basically, I think I would really like to retire. And as Bill said, at that point, you couldn't retire because your 401k, at least if it was mainly energy stocks, weren't worth much 18 months ago, unlike the record performance they've had in the last year. And what happened was they all said, when this is done, I'm then going to look to do X, be either retire, move to a chairman role, go from 3 boards to 1 board, whatever it might be, and so forth. So what we found is The energy market, we think, is just experiencing that now. In the last quarter or two, it started, and there's more to come. On the tech side, on the retail side, on the hospitality side, it's already started, and it's been going for quite a bit. The shuffle, especially on the tech side, is where we see it most. But energy, I think there's still quite a bit more to come.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that too, because I agree with everything Dave just said, is there's kind of two things you've got to focus on. One is let's retain the employees we have, right? Because I think we all know the data that it's easier to keep an employee and retain them than to hire a new one and go through all the training and expense of that. So one is, what are we going to do to change our policies, our practices, what's accepted, our benefits for the existing employees? And then the second one is, how do we hire new employees to fill those gaps of the people who have left? And how do we have to change our hiring practices and, again, benefits, et cetera? So I think there's two camps. We have to make sure we focus on both of those.
So thinking about that we've got, more change coming in certain industries, and, that this may be like a permanent underlying shift in how people think about work. What are some of the remedies that you would suggest, that you've seen, that companies are considering? How should we approach this?
David, to take it in a little different direction, I think it's imperative for companies to revisit their strategies. If you think about pre-COVID, many companies were running full out, pedal to the metal, so to speak. Some of the things that were being done were incremental. They probably weren't all that profitable in the greater scheme of things. And companies are having to refocus now. And if you think about who you're going to recruit, who you're going to try to retain, what are they going to be connected to? Is there clarity about the business strategy, the direction, the priorities? Many companies were undergoing transformation and had to step on the brakes hard. In the case of airlines, initially we lost 95% of our 2019 revenue. So some of the more innovative things we were doing had to go on hold. And, in the process, you changed the opportunity set for people that had been hired. You brought people in from other industries, and all of a sudden what they were going to work on is on hold, and it's not clear when it's going to come back. So I think it's imperative for companies to be clear about what their priorities are. And we know in the companies I'm involved with that we have some work to do to pay down debt, to refocus, and we're doing it, but refocus the priorities. And I think if you start there, it gives you clarity for communicating with employees and knowing the types of people you want to retain and hire. One of the speakers, David, I'm sorry, David or Carol mentioned this idea of purpose. I think that's incredibly important, and we don't often talk about that enough. And I'm jumping way ahead, but one of the things that was so important during the COVID period was communications. People are dying for information and clarity around where we're going, what's happening. So I think as companies, we have to do that. And I would almost argue you do that before you start addressing the remedies for the great turnover here.
Yeah, and I would add, because I think Bill's exactly right. I mean, there was a lot of strategy work done, especially coming out of this, very much so, on what it means for the other side. And part of the strategy process we're discovering, because we're getting pulled in on it now on our consulting side, is this issue around creating the purpose and the belonging. Because the one thing you cannot do, the answer for this is not benefits and just money by itself. You can't money whip this, because it's much bigger than that. So what we found was things like diversity and inclusion were part of the strategy now. So DEI went way up the list. The Black Lives Matters movement, I think, changed that in corporate America forever, one. And then two, the whole idea of culture now is front row, where before I think a lot of it was around numbers and financial, not always, but on the strategy that had probably some of the most coverage. Now we're finding that culture has become a very big issue. And then from the board level, we probably saw more succession work than we've seen in a decade. And that is and not just at the board level, but also at the executive level and on down the company, which also deals then with retention and culture and things like that. And then there were some basic things of basically return to work, just how are we going to offer flexibility? What's that going to look like? A lot of companies still have not even put those policies out. Some of our clients are still not back to work in certain regions of the country. And what it made us realize is a real war on talent has started now because of, you could see the numbers before, the finite number of potential candidates for open positions. And companies have to be much more clever on keeping who they have and how they attract someone new. And it's as competitive as we have ever seen it.
And I'll just add quickly on the culture side, totally agree. Diversity, equity, inclusion absolutely has to be a top priority. I think the other top priority is ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance, and how are we as a company and our culture going to really focus on ESG and really bring that to the forefront? Because again, people are caring about what our company does for society and for the greater good, and it's sustainability and all those things that are now becoming more important. And just to touch on, and this is very detail oriented, but I found it so fascinating when, Dave, you talked about the benefits, and you're right, it's not just the benefits, but I wanted to throw out a few of the benefits that I've heard companies start doing now, just to get your mind thinking about that a little bit in your company. So a lot of companies have either started or proposed unlimited vacation. And there is a study that shows when you do offer unlimited vacation, people actually take less vacation than they would have normally, which I find fascinating. And I'm still trying to get my arms around that because I'm not sure I'd behave that way. But, unlimited vacation, maybe they're going to offer sabbaticals, to David's point about people are having some burnout. So, hey, let's give you 6 months off or a year off to take a sabbatical and get your head together, but then you come back and we retain you as an employee. I also heard one for offering foreign language lessons and being able to pay for that because this employee was interested in a different language and maybe would go to one of the branch offices internationally. And another one was mental health days, which we hadn't really heard of before. But again, because of all these Zoom calls, maybe someone needs a mental health day, or the year-end holiday time off, right? Which many companies already do, but some didn't. But maybe it's time to start executing that. And there's many more, but those just caught my eye to say we are really shifting our thinking of what corporate America might offer when it comes to benefits. And Dave and Bill, you probably have lots more examples, but just a few that caught my eye.
Carol, one thing you made me think of, so we have a subsidiary called the Business Talent Group. We just bought like 2 years ago, and they do part-time executive help. And for the first, and that's exploded. They had their biggest year in history. They were up by 60% previous in a year, the growth. But one of the unique things companies were doing were hiring executives to allow that leave. And especially on the HR side, where this war on talent has been so big, bringing in extra help so other people could take extended time off. And not just because, hey, we need it because we're hiring so much. We're going to do this so someone else can go take a rest. And we had never seen that before. So it's kind of interesting how they're starting to use part-time folks more and more too.
Yeah. So it sounds like, and some of the articles that I've read on the subject said this as well, that there's some basic blocking and tackling to do, as Bill said, about understanding who we are and where we want to go, and presumably who are the right kind of people for this organization. And then following on with that, very customized solutions and creativity, like Carol was listing out a lot of different things that companies are thinking sort of outside the box of what you would have normally thought were part of work, benefits, or in the boardroom, as you think about the boards that you serve on, what are some of the ways that you would suggest that directors think about helping their companies think about this? What sorts of things should you be doing as a director, maybe differently from what you've done before?
Well, for me, I guess I'd begin by saying I'm not sure that the the areas of focus are different. I would say they've broadened in some instances and more intensity is required. I mean, if you think about the primary role of directors, I mean, one of the things that stuck with me from my beginning days as serving on boards was directors should have their nose in and fingers out. And so we're not there to run the company. And if you think about our primary objectives, well, clearly it's hiring the CEO, supporting them. You can add succession planning to that, strategy and performance. And then there's compliance, there's policy, and there's reputation, all of which have become more complicated with ESG, social media, et cetera. So I think it's imperative that we stay in our lane, so to speak, but that we have to work even more closely with not only the CEO, but the leadership team. You know, depending upon the maturity of the company, you may have, reasonably young leaders that haven't had a lot of experience in some of these areas, or just dealing with the change requires the board to bring its expertise, its experience, its wisdom to the table. You know, SOX dramatically changed the role of directors going back 20 years ago. So, you know, this is a hands-on kind of activity, but again, you know, in our lane. You know, I think we have to talk about strategy, as I mentioned earlier, and make sure we're clear. I think we have to address human capital holistically. I chose those words pretty carefully because I think there's no one answer. I think you have to tailor something that matches your organization. And I start from a basic premise that people want to do meaningful work, they want to be included, they want to be valued. And then we can add a lot of things onto that as appropriate, but how do we make sure that that's happening? And let's face it, some organizations are just not right for certain people. Some organizations have to move into a more modern mindset. You know, I've talked about the strategies, so I won't go back into that much other than to say, you know, we have to think about how companies have been hurt or helped by the environment. I mean, there's both challenges and opportunities, and we've seen that. You know, I think you have to look at the resources that are required. You know, are they available? Are they more or less available? What are we going to have to do to get those? And then I've mentioned this, but this whole notion of stakeholder requirements or expectations changing. You know, if we go back to the E&P space in particular, it's not just grow, 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 it's return capital and grow and produce. And of course, all of this has to be done in a much more environmentally responsive way. I think it's important that we make sure as directors that the measures of performance are both rigorous and clear. You know, we've all had in organizations a lot of sacred cows, things that we just keep doing because we always have. We didn't want to bite the bullet and make hard decisions. COVID made that happen. So in many cases, we've already cleaned up. So let's not let that dead wood come back. But if we haven't cleaned up enough, let's make sure we do that so that we're working on the right things. And then again, I think as directors, you just can't say enough about the role we have to play around reputation, around policy. I mean, on the boards I'm on, we're retooling our committee responsibilities to put a sharper focus on ESG. You know, whether you have a specific committee that focuses on that and say public policy, whether you revise the Nom and Governance Committee, however you choose to handle it, the point is that you have to handle it. And I think there was a tendency in the past for that to be more strictly the domain of management, but it's become more complicated and it has far-reaching effects for the organization. So the board has to be involved in the high-level discussions around that. And we see often that companies are drawn into political issues. interesting articles that say, companies are no longer party to the political process, that we're being ignored, that our voices have been diminished. But when you look at all the things coming down the pike, you can't afford to not participate, not influence what's going on. So again, to close or to summarize, I think the roles are the same, but I think the intensity of what we need to do, the level of engagement with management is higher.
So I'll add a few points to that and agree with much of what you said there, Bill, and hopefully won't be too repetitive on some of this. But in general, I think about not all companies have shifted from just shareholder value and mentality to stakeholder mentality. And so I see that shift happening now. When I think about stakeholders, right, it's the investors, of course. Employees have now really risen up to the top of a really big focus for companies, the community, like we talked about, suppliers, and of course, customers. So I really think the board of directors has to focus on all of those stakeholders and make sure that they're doing the right thing for each of those areas. So we talked about definitely with employees, we've got to have that mission, the vision, the culture. We've got to really instill that and maybe augment it because of how things are changing, but make sure that everybody sees that and that the employees believe in it and feel like that's the right culture and where they want to be. So shift it to what today's thinking is. And then we have to remember now employees have more bargaining power than they ever had before, right? Because they can shift so easily. So let's get the benefits right. Let's make sure that they're doing some benchmarking in the industry. One of the companies I talked to said, we thought we were paying a fair wage and we really weren't because we weren't up to date on what the latest benchmarking said because the salaries had changed so much. So making sure that the executive team is up to speed on all of that, invest in some funding to make sure that they can get the data that they need. And then, when you think about these employees shifting around, company loyalty is not like it used to be. And I personally think it goes both ways, right? So we want the employees loyal to the company, but therefore, as a company, we need to be loyal to them. So we need to make sure it's going both ways and we're providing what they need and listening to them. Employees want to be heard. So we need to make sure the executive team is listening and implementing the changes. As always, we've got to provide growth opportunities for those employees too, so they know, hey, the grass isn't greener over there. We've got these growth opportunities and you can move ahead. And then I think strongly as people come back in the office, we've got to really help the board of directors, help the CEO and the executive team think about the vaccine policy. How strong are you going to be on it? Are you going to require it? If you do, are you willing to take the implications for the really important senior or critical employees that maybe don't want to get vaccinated and get a good, strong policy in place for when they come back to work? Because it's going to be critical. You think through it and you know what you're doing and you're all on board with what that policy is going to be. The other thing is through this pandemic, I think customer service has really declined, and you can see that in services businesses. You can see the supply chain issues. You can see those. And if you think again that in the stakeholders, you've got your customers as well. We need to see who's going to bring that customer service back, right? And make that a priority. Or are we just going to say, you know what? The customers got used to this level of service, so we're going to leave it at that. I think the companies that step it up and bring it back to where it used to be or even better are going to be the long-term winners. So think about how you may have to evolve what you're doing to get that service back where it used to be. And we said ESG and DEI are really critical, so make sure those are in your culture and your plan. And then the last thing I want to touch on, David, because you asked this earlier too, is what do we do for the CEO and the executives and the retention there, right? Because we are either seeing that or going to be seeing that. So of course, we've got to have a strong succession plan in place. And it's not just one person for the CEO. It's the entire executive team. It's the board of directors. It's the CEO. We need that succession plan. probably a few alternatives, not just one. And in doing that, what you have to do is a great assessment on who's the top talent in the organization and how do we retain that top talent? What kind of training do we give them? What kind of development? What kind of mentoring and shadowing do we do? So it's clear that they're in succession, and that will motivate them for staying as well. And then, of course, I've seen some examples, and I think you've probably even seen in the news, some executives didn't follow those COVID or vaccine policies. It ended up like having to step down or step aside or whatever. So when you put that policy in place, you need to make sure it's the same policy for your executive team. Your leaders have to walk the talk, right? So make sure that those CEO and executives are bought into the policy you put in place and are following it. And then, of course, what about all those long-term incentives? Can we bring some of those back? Pensions, not so big anymore, but maybe we need to provide something to keep some of that executive team. Long-term incentives, be it stock options or stock grants that vest over 3 years or 5 years, so we can keep some of that talent. Maybe non-competes need to be a little bit stronger, and that's maybe not a positive way. It might be more of a, you know, we want to keep you, but maybe, you know, having that non-compete in place may help. So I think some of those things need to be done for the CEO and executive team to make sure that we keep them happy and engaged and not looking to jump elsewhere.
And David, the only thing I'd just add briefly is net, what we kind of feel like is the pandemic has basically taken 10 years of advancement in corporate America and shrunk it to today, like literally accelerated everything. And our family, we actually finally, because we got to see the kids and they came back and had a lot of fun, a lot of late night dinners talking about stuff. And the kids were talking to us, opposed to the teen years when they were quiet. But in all seriousness, what happened is we call it the lost years, because it's hard to what day of the week is it, what month, what year are we in, that kind of thing. But what happened was it accelerated all that. And the challenge I think corporate America has is, in general today, and it's factual, most of the Fortune 500 all are middle-aged white males who grew up at a different time in a different culture. I'm one of them, for example, and so forth. The world has evolved past that, and trying to make that adjustment is the hardest part, and culture is a huge amount of that. And as Carol mentioned earlier, with the millennials and the Gen Zs, they've got to learn how to listen to their employees, because that wasn't an issue before. You listen and talk when spoken to. That's not the case at all anymore. So trying to catch up with that now is a big issue as we go ahead and evolve management and evolve corporate America.
I'm sorry, Bill.
No, I'll just say I agree with that very much. I think that you can't underestimate the value of culture. I mean, I'm going through a transition with one company now, and it's just remarkable to see how the organization is responding, and it's almost as if they've been uncaged, and they have a collective smile on their face about the changes. And if you ask how much it's changing, is it 20%? It's not 50%, but it's enough that people feel freed up and again able to contribute, and they're feeling valued, and they're getting role clarity for their businesses. So it's so important. And yes, I include EDI in that, because you know, we're in this huge fight for talent, and we can't afford to exclude anyone. I mean, I like to say God didn't leave anyone out of the talent mix, and mostly it's about people having opportunity. It might be for the underlying education. I think as we sit here as a group today, it's also largely about an opportunity to perform, to be engaged. And it's just always rewarding to see how people show up, how they rise to the occasion. And again, as you get more diverse teams, people working in different ways, how do we come together? How do we work together to achieve the objectives? You can't ignore people. You can't discount people, or if you do it at your peril, at the company's peril. So, and I guess while I'm on the subject of EDI, I would say that we're at an interesting crossroads around that effort. I think people put forth in good faith, in most cases, very definitive plans going back 2 years ago, 18 months ago. And we know what the catalyst of that was. The question is, are we following through? Are definitive things happening? And I always smiled when I saw how many companies were going to go to historically Black colleges and universities to recruit talent. Well, I mean, that's admirable, but, there are limits to how many people are there. And there are many companies that have been at those institutions for a long time. So I go through that to say, don't just offer platitudes, figure out what's going to move the needle. What are you going to have to do? And what I'm also saying is that it's incredibly important to hire, but it's also incredibly important to retain. And inclusion is at the juncture of those two things. We go out and we hire people, and then we don't really change our practices and our approach to how we treat people, how we're organized, how we communicate. And people, again, because they have options today, say, well, this is not what it was presented as, and maybe this is not the right place to me. And someone knocks on the door, often with a better offer, and they leave. So I think companies have to be very thoughtful. I'd say, yeah, there's maybe extra effort required if you think about diverse candidates, but that same logic applies to everyone. I mean, I don't care race, gender. So your majority population, as we've talked about today, is just as much at risk. So again, I argue for thoughtfulness around how we're dealing with our culture and our people.
That's all great context. Thank you.